Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is something sweet waiting for you. A piece of chocolate, a soda in the fridge, a jar of honey you barely think about. You reach for it without hesitation. But the real answer to why you want it is far stranger than a craving. It starts long before supermarkets, long before farms, long before humans could even be called human. Your desire for sugar is not a modern habit. It is a fossil, a behavior so old it was carved into your brain before language existed. So when did this actually begin? And why does something so simple still control so much of what you eat today? 2 million years ago, there was no such thing as a candy bar. There was no cane sugar, no syrup, no bag of white crystals on a shelf. But there was fruit, ripe, soft, fermenting slightly in the heat. And there were early hominins moving through forests and grasslands, searching for anything calorie-dense enough to keep their bodies running. Sugar, in its natural form, was rare. It was seasonal. It was hidden. And that scarcity is the whole story. Think about what a piece of ripe fruit actually offered an early human ancestor. It offered fast energy, not the slow-burning kind from tough roots or fibrous leaves, but immediate, usable fuel. A brain that was rapidly growing in size needed exactly that. Researchers like Catherine Milton, a biological anthropologist who spent decades studying primate diets, found that fruit-eating primates often have larger brains relative to their body size than leaf-eating primates. The sugar in fruit was not a treat. It was an investment in cognition. So your ancestors were not choosing sugar because it tasted good in some abstract sense. They were choosing it because it kept them alive, and it kept their offspring's brains developing. Every bite of a sun-ripened fig or wild berry was a small transaction with survival. The ones who could detect sweetness fastest and wanted it most outcompeted the ones who couldn't. This is not a metaphor. This is natural selection, written directly onto your tongue. Picture two early hominins walking through the same patch of forest. One pauses at a cluster of half-hidden berries, barely noticing them. The other stops immediately, drawn in by a faint sweetness carried on the air. Which one eats more today? Which one is more likely to survive a lean season? Over hundreds of thousands of generations, that small difference in sensitivity compounds into something enormous. It becomes a species-wide trait. It becomes you, standing in front of an open fridge, unable to look away from something sweet. This is also why sugar detection evolved to work so fast. Your tongue doesn't need to think about sweetness. It reacts before conscious thought even catches up. That speed was not an accident. In an environment full of threats, hesitation could cost an early human a meal to a rival, a troop of monkeys, or a passing bird. The ones who reacted instantly to sweetness, grabbing it before anyone else could, passed on that same quick-triggered system to you. Your taste buds still carry that history. Sweetness is detected by specific receptors, and those receptors are tuned to notice sugar in concentrations far lower than you'd think. Bitter, by contrast, is a warning system. It tells you something might be toxic. Sweet tells you something is safe and worth eating as much of as possible. That asymmetry was not designed for a world with vending machines. It was designed for a world where sugar was so scarce that overeating it was never really a risk. There was no such thing as too much fruit. There was only not enough. But fruit was not the biggest prize. Honey was. Long before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent settlements, early humans were already going to extraordinary lengths to get honey. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe studied the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania whose way of life offers a living window into deep human history. Marlowe found that honey was one of the most highly valued and sought-after foods among the Hadza, often ranked above meat. Men would climb tall trees, endure stings from aggressive African bees, and risk real physical danger, all for access to a sugary, calorie-dense substance hidden inside a hive. Why go through all that pain for something so small? Because the payoff was enormous. Honey is one of the most concentrated natural sugar sources on Earth. A single raid on a wild hive could deliver more usable energy in minutes than hours of foraging for tubers or greens. And that energy mattered enormously to a species whose brain was consuming a disproportionate share of its daily calories. Some estimates suggest the human brain uses around 20% of the body's energy at rest, despite being a small fraction of total body mass. Sugar was fuel for the most expensive organ you own. There's something else remarkable here. Humans are not the only species that seeks out honey. Chimpanzees do it too, using sticks as tools to extract it from hives. This tells you something important. The drive toward concentrated sugar is not a uniquely human invention. It's a primate inheritance, shared with your closest evolutionary relatives, going back millions of years before Homo sapiens existed at all. Some researchers have even suggested that this shared obsession with honey may have shaped early tool use itself. Extracting honey from a defended hive is not simple. It requires planning, patience, and often a tool to reach deep into a hollow tree without getting stung to death. A chimpanzee stripping a stick to fish termites, or a stick to raid a hive, is solving the exact same problem an early hominin ancestor once faced. Get the sugar. Minimize the damage. Every generation that solved this problem a little better passed that skill forward. And honey wasn't the only prize hidden behind effort. Ancient humans across Africa and Asia also collected wild tubers, some of which stored small amounts of natural sugars underground, safe from competitors, but requiring real labor to dig up. The pattern repeats constantly throughout human prehistory. Sugar is never handed over easily. It is climbed for, dug for, defended against stings, and fought for against other hungry animals. Scarcity was the rule, not the exception. Now here's where the story takes a turn most people never think about. Cooking changed everything. Primatologist and evolutionary biologist Richard Wrangham proposed what's become known as the cooking hypothesis. The idea that the controlled use of fire to cook food was a turning point in human evolution. Cooking doesn't just make food taste different. It breaks down starches and fibers, making calories easier to extract and digest. Wrangham's research suggests that once early humans, likely Homo erectus, began cooking food regularly, they gained access to far more usable energy from the same amount of food. That extra energy, in turn, may have helped fuel the growth of an even larger brain. Cooking effectively pre-digested food before it entered the body. Starchy roots, once tough and low yield, became soft, sweet, and calorie-rich after roasting. In a very real sense, cooking multiplied the sugar economy available to early humans, without a single grain of cane sugar ever existing. So for the overwhelming majority of human history, sugar meant fruit in season, honey defended by stinging insects, and roasted starches transformed by fire. It was rare. It was earned. And your body built an entire reward system around chasing it. That reward system runs on dopamine. When early humans found something sweet, their brains released dopamine, reinforcing the search and consume behavior that led them there. This wasn't laziness or weakness. It was precision engineering by evolution. A brain that felt intense pleasure from sugar was a brain more likely to prioritize finding it again. Multiply that decision across hundreds of thousands of years, and you get a species hardwired to treat sugar as one of the most rewarding substances on Earth. Consider what this reward system had to accomplish. It had to make a rare, hard-to-find resource feel urgent enough to justify real risk. Climbing a tall tree with no safety equipment. Reaching into a dark hollow where a snake might be coiled. Enduring dozens of stings from defensive bees. None of that makes sense, unless the payoff, in the brain's chemistry, feels enormous. Evolution solved this by tying sugar directly into the same reward pathways later co-opted by nearly every pleasurable experience humans seek out. Sugar wasn't competing with other rewards. In many ways, it helped define what a reward even feels like. Now ask yourself something. What happens when a system built for scarcity suddenly meets abundance? That's exactly what happened, but not right away. For tens of thousands of years, nothing changed. Sugar stayed rare. Then, around 10,000 years ago, agriculture began reshaping human life, and with it, human diets. Grains became dominant. Starches became more reliable. But concentrated sugar, the kind found in honey or ripe fruit, remained a special, limited resource. Sugarcane itself was first domesticated in New Guinea thousands of years ago, But for most of the ancient world, it stayed a regional crop, chewed raw or brewed into drinks, not refined into the white crystalline substance you'd recognize today. It took centuries for sugar refinement to spread from South Asia into the Mediterranean and beyond. Even then, for most of human history, refined sugar remained a luxury. In medieval Europe, sugar was so expensive it was locked away in cabinets, treated almost like a spice or a medicine, available only to the wealthy. Ordinary people still relied on honey, fruit, and whatever natural sweetness their environment offered. Your ancient reward system stayed largely untouched. Sugar was still hard to get. Think about that contrast for a moment. For roughly 2 million years, sugar meant seasonal fruit and defended beehives. For the next several thousand years of early civilization, it meant an expensive imported luxury, doled out in small amounts to the powerful and wealthy. Only in the last 2 or 3 centuries, a blink of an eye, in evolutionary terms, did sugar become cheap, constant, and available to almost everyone. Your genes had no time to adjust. They are still calibrated for a world of scarcity, dropped suddenly into a world of surplus. Everything shifted with colonial plantation economies and, later, industrialization. Sugar production scaled up dramatically, prices dropped, availability exploded. For the first time in the entire span of human existence, a brain built to crave rare, hard-won sweetness was suddenly surrounded by sugar in nearly unlimited supply. Not hidden in a beehive, not seasonal on a tree, sitting on a shelf, in a bottle, in a wrapper, available every single day. Here's the twist most people miss. Your body never got the memo that the environment changed. The dopamine response that once rewarded a life-saving honey raid now fires just as intensely for a candy bar picked up at a checkout counter. The reward circuitry doesn't know the difference between a rare prehistoric treasure and a mass-produced snack. To your ancient brain, sugar is still sugar, and sugar still means survival. This is why sugar can feel almost impossible to resist. You are not weak. You are running software, written for a world that no longer exists. A world where a sweet find might be the difference between a malnourished season and a well-fed one. A world where craving sugar intensely was an advantage, not a liability. Modern food science understood this deeply, even if most consumers didn't. Food companies learned to engineer products that hit the same ancient reward pathways as honey once did, but with far greater intensity and far greater frequency. What once required climbing a tree and risking bee stings now requires walking down an aisle. The reward is the same. The effort required has collapsed to almost nothing. Some scientists describe this as a mismatch. Your body is running an ancient program in a completely new environment, and the program was never built with brakes. It has an accelerator, tuned by millions of years of scarcity, but no equivalent system telling it to stop once abundance arrives. Why would evolution build a brake for a resource that was never available in dangerous excess? There was no version of prehistoric life where a person could eat too much wild honey. The hive would run out, the season would end, competitors would show up. Nature imposed the limits. Once those natural limits disappeared, nothing internal replaced them. This helps explain patterns researchers see across the modern world, from rising rates of metabolic disease to the sheer difficulty most people report when trying to cut back on sweet foods. It is not simply about willpower. It is a genuine mismatch between an ancient reward system and a radically new food environment. Recognizing that mismatch doesn't excuse overindulgence, but it does explain why the pull feels so much stronger than simple preference. So when you feel that pull toward something sweet, at 3 in the afternoon, in a moment of stress, or simply out of habit, you are feeling the same neurological pathway that once sent a Hadza forager climbing 40 feet into a tree, arms stinging, chasing a few mouthfuls of wild honey. You're not broken. You're ancient. There's something oddly humbling in that. Your cravings are not a personal failure. They're an inheritance, a signal passed down from ancestors who survived, in part because they wanted sugar badly enough to take real risks for it. The problem isn't that your brain wants sugar. The problem is that the world stopped making it rare. Understanding this doesn't erase the craving, but it does change what it means. The next time you reach for something sweet without thinking, you're not just satisfying a whim. You're participating in a ritual that stretches back through cooking fires, through wild beehives, through fruit-laden trees your ancestors climbed long before they had words for what they were doing. So somewhere in your kitchen, there is still something sweet waiting for you. But now you know it isn't just sugar. It's a message from millions of years ago, still arriving right on time.